Hello, everyone. Welcome to KEI. My name is Kyle Ferrier. I'm the Director of Academic Affairs and Research here at KEI. Thank you all for coming. I'm heartened to see so many of you despite the weather. It seems as if there's a number of outside powers actually working against us. We had planned to do this program in late April, but because of the summits that have been announced recently, we had to move everything up to keep up with the news cycle. And now with the weather yesterday, and myself and Colonel Maxwell were actually in San Antonio for a conference. We weren't sure if we were going to make it back, so we're glad that we're all here and that you're all here to join us for this program about Dr. Blank's paper. Now, back in October, we had an event on this stage about how North Korea is reported on in the media. And one of the criticisms that was raised then in that program, and I would encourage you to look it up on our website, on our YouTube page if you haven't seen the event already. But one of the criticisms of how North Korea is reported on is that it sometimes, well, it's often a echo chamber. Wherein people repeat the same ideas back and forth, and that was one of the criticisms that they raised there. And it was about that time I was also looking at Dr. Blank's proposal as part of our academic paper series, and in which he offers a number of new ideas based off of well-reasoned analyses. And I'm sure you'll. I hope you agree with me that you think this is a welcome contribution to the discussions we're having right now on North Korea at this important, critical time in the relationship. Now, Dr. Blank is an internationally recognized expert on Russia, the Russian foreign and defense policies, and international relations across the former Soviet Union. He is also a leading expert on European and Asian security. Since 2013, he has been a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council here in D.C., and from 1989 to 2013, he was a professor of Russian National Security Studies at the U.S. Army War College in Pennsylvania. So Dr. Blank will be presenting his paper, which you all have in front of you, called A Way Out of the North Korean Labyrinth. He'll be presenting his paper and soon be followed by Colonel Maxwell, who I'll introduce later as he gives his remarks as the discussant for Dr. Blank's paper. So now I'll turn things over to Dr. Blank.
Thank you, Kyle. It's a great pleasure to be here today. It may sound strange to you that a Russia expert is writing about peace proposals for the Korean Peninsula. I should also add that I've written a great deal in my time, and you can find it on the web, or you can ask me about it, about Russia and East Asia in general, and in particular Russia's Korea policy and the six-party relationships in Northeast Asia. And I'm about to start a book on Russian Asian policy in general. And I wrote this because, having come to Korean issues from that perspective, I see things differently than the echo chamber, or what Ben Rhodes called the blob. Infamously, I'm part of the blob now, so I accept my responsibilities. But I was becoming increasingly angry, to be frank, about American policy and the dead end it seemed to be going towards, because I actually think that there was a momentum towards war. And I thought that we are not looking at the North Korean issue of nuclear policy and so on in the proper light, or in a light that is conducive to resolution. Because the old policy, and I'm old enough to remember back in the 90s, when Dave knows this also, when Cold War ended, there was a whole literature saying the great threat we have is nuclear proliferation. And North Korea is a poster child. Iran is the other for this. North Korea now has nuclear weapons. Whether we recognize it de jure or de facto as a nuclear weapon state, in fact, it has a developing nuclear and missile capability. Certainly, it can do immense damage to Japan and South Korea. And it might even be able to reach some American territories, like maybe Alaska, Hawaii, Guam, and so on. And its capabilities are only improving. So so in my view, that horse is out of the barn. We are not going to be able to denuclearize North Korea unless we pay an extremely high price for doing so. But at the same time, crisis, as the Chinese ideogram points out, is an opportunity as well as a challenge. And if we see North Korea, and I've seen it this way for years, in the context of a regional security dilemma, rather than as primarily a proliferation problem, it becomes, I think, easier to envisage a way out of the labyrinth. Otherwise, we will be like Theseus in the Greek, or not Theseus, he's the one who gets out, but in the Greek myth, all those people who get trapped in the labyrinth and can't find a way out. And if you can't find a way out, then either the solutions are going to be negative ones diplomatically and politically, or God forbid, a war. And by February, before the summit came into sight, all of you were seeing this. We had a lot of officials in this town who were publicly talking with favor about the idea of, quote, giving North Korea a bloody nose. The idea that you could have some sort of limited strike against North Korea, take out some or all of its nuclear capability, even though you don't know where it is, and that would bring them to the table. Such thinking is dangerous and reckless. And having worked for the military for 27 years, it's not the first time I've seen such ideas, and they were no better then than they are now. Because in my view, North Korea cannot afford any kind of military defeat. There is no preparation for what would happen if North Korea collapsed, so far as anybody can tell. And third, nobody was talking about what the political outcome of the war is. And as David and I are both veterans of the military, although I've never served in it but worked for it, we all know that the purpose of war is to bring about a better peace. And if you don't know why you are fighting or what you want to see when it's over, you're going to lose, regardless of whatever superiorities you may have. So the idea that we could have a limited war, limited strike, if you want to prefer that, and that would compel North Korea to come to the table was a fantasy. And it remains a fantasy. I fully believe, and Secretary Mattis has said so, there is no viable military solution that advances American interests. Because if there's no viable military solution, then the answer has to be some sort of political resolution. Military pressure is part of it. And I do not renounce the idea of making threats and bringing pressure to bear to get people to the table. But there has to be a context for that. And now, since the summit has been agreed to, the necessity of devising a true policy, what do we want to see with regard to North Korea? And even more importantly, what do we want to see in Northeast Asia, an extremely dynamic region, is critical. And to be, again, absolutely frank with you, I don't have a lot of confidence in the way things are going in this government. There's no Secretary of State at the moment. In effect, you have a lame duck sitting there until Mr. Pompeo is confirmed. There is no Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia. There's no ambassador in South Korea. And we just blindsided Tokyo. And the president clearly is not constrained by any institution or persons. Called up Vladimir Putin the other day and offered to have a summit without any preparation whatsoever, which is mind-boggling. But that's what he did with Kim Jong-un as well. So we should be now habituated a bit to this kind of lack of planning. And as one of the icons of the U.S. Army, Dwight Eisenhower, said, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And that applies to foreign policy as well. So it's very difficult to determine if even now there's a coherent administration policy towards North Korea. And we saw in the recent past, up to the announcement of the summit, that there were contradictions between members of the administration. And as a result, you would have one person saying we're prepared to negotiate without conditions, and others saying we want to go to war. And the result was a series of people entertaining ideas that were literally, quote, fantastic, fantasies. We will negotiate without conditions. Well, the president embraced that ultimately, except that the North Koreans went ahead and suspended their nuclear and missile testing for the interval until then. And the other fantastic idea was that there could be a limited strike. A third one is time is running out. I hate to tell this to the people who believe that time is running out. Time ran out a long time ago. Time to stop North Korean nuclearizations during the Bush administration. Even under Obama, it was too late. And Obama, to be honest, had no Korea policy. Strategic patience is an abdication of policy. Sounds nice, but it means I don't know what to do. And I don't know, doing anything would probably be worse than doing nothing, so I'll do nothing. But doing nothing doesn't work either. So we have a situation now where the summit is going to take place, and North Korea has suspended for the interval its nuclear and missile testing program. And that supposedly has convinced the government here that North Korea is willing to talk about denuclearization. Now, anybody who's ever studied this problem for 10 minutes or more knows that North Korea's idea of denuclearization is not ours, and that the price they're going to demand is excessive by what is current American policy. Current American policy, however, needs to change. Why? First of all, because there's going to be a summit, and we have given away the recognition of North Korea without any tangible concession. Because I believe that, and I have another article coming out that says this, one of the reasons Kim Jong-un made the concession is because he's now confident in his military capabilities. And he can afford to take time, especially as the economic constraints of the sanctions are hurting the country. And he, unlike his father and grandfather, is more concerned about making North Korea a prosperous, flourishing economy. And there are sources that will show you that. However, it is essential that we take the initiative with a well-crafted plan that meets the interests not only of the United States, but of Tokyo and Seoul. Because if we don't, somebody else will, whether that's Moscow, Beijing, or Pyongyang. Those are adversarial states, to say the least. And what's more, if you look at the Korean problem again in that regional perspective, what we are dealing with today in Northeast Asia are increasing signs, and many analysts in the government, I think, believe this, of a Sino-Russian alliance. Russia and China are, for the most part, identical in their positions on Korea. They are certainly united in their hostility to the placement of the THAAD missile defense system in South Korea and Japan. And one of the animating factors in both polities is the anti-American drive of their foreign policies, and that's going to get worse for a variety of reasons. We'll talk about that in the Q&A. Therefore, we cannot leave to those states the key leading or initiating role. And moreover, time is of the essence, because if there's anything that doesn't work for us, it's time, because North Korea's capabilities are increasing. And as North Korea's capabilities are increasing, its political leverage grows with it, as does the leverage of China and Russia, because they're the only powers right now that have any kind of dialogue in a meaningful way with it. And therefore, you have to use the time at your disposal in a constructive way. There's a wonderful epigram or statement that you used to see, particularly in Israel in the old days, about the founding Prime Minister Ben Gurion. He said that time works for us or against it, depending on how we use it. So we got to use the time that we have in order to come up with a proposal that not only answers the bell with regard to the nuclear weapons in North Korea, but to the larger issues of Northeast Asian security and the role of North Korea in a post-Cold War Northeast Asia. That said, U.S. policymakers, as I claim, have entertained a lot of illusions. One, that we could force regime change somehow by pressure, threat of war, or actual, as some people entertain, military strikes. Second, the idea that time is running out, that North Korea is about to attack. There's no sign of that. And as, again, a former analyst who worked with the military, and David knows as well, there are plenty of indicators, what we call early warning. We would know, or we should know, that something was going to come down and should be able to prepare for it. We haven't heard anything about that so far. Granted, you're not going to hear a lot of it in the press, because we're not going to give away sources and methods. But early warning will be recognized, or should be recognized, when and if it occurs. Third, there's the idea that Kim Jong-un is crazy, and that nothing will get him to the table unless we hit him in the face with weapons. Problem is, if you hit him in the face with weapons, why would he negotiate then? Because he's not going to accept defeat. He can't. That's the end of his rule. And Victor Cha pointed this out and then paid for it because he's not now the ambassador to South Korea, even though before that he was in the Bush administration and at the six-party talks. Furthermore, at least 15 or 17 years ago, when I was at the Army War College, we published an article by our boss, who had been the Army attaché in China, saying that the Chinese had told him that if you invade North Korea, you will meet us there. If anything, that resolve has strengthened in the interval. So if you want to have a replay on a much grander scale of the Korean War, with China and the U.S. fighting each other, this is a sure way to bring it about. And I don't think there's anybody in the administration, for all their tough talk, who wants that. Furthermore, we had the illusion that we could pressure China and or Russia and that they would pull our chestnuts out of the fire for us. They would deliver North Korea to the table because it's supposedly in our interest or their interest. Well, that's defining Chinese national interest, or to a lesser degree, Russian national interest, in terms of American desiderata. And the first thing you need to know is that these people do not think the way we do. You know, after 40 years in this business, I'm still finding people who believe that the Russians calculate the way we do and see the world exactly as if they came from Indiana or Manhattan. Not so. If anything, they resent the pressure. They don't want North Korea to start a war. They don't like the idea of North Korea being a nuclear power because it goes against some of their interests. But the idea that North Korea is undermining American power and presence in Northeast Asia works for them much better than the other irritations that North Korea provides to them. And they are not going to sacrifice whatever leverage they think they might have for our benefit. Furthermore, China claims more or less that it has leverage, but that if it uses it, it will lose it. Well, if it won't use it, it doesn't have it. I'm simplifying, but you understand the idea. And Russia has even less leverage. Because the Russians' game in this whole matter is trying to get in and be taken seriously as a major player. So the Russians are now saying, well, we could have the meeting in Vladivostok. Putin could come there. Trump could come there. Putin and Trump could have their summit. Kim Jong-un could come there, have his summit too. And we will look wonderful. And we'll have all this prestige and status as a major player in Asia, which is what Russia really covets, but can't attain because of its own domestic Catholicism. So the point here is that the illusion that China and Russia, or Russia, will do our heavy lifting is an illusion. It absolves us of the responsibility of confronting this problem directly, and it takes our eyes off the ball and the opportunities that we do have with regard to North Korea in restructuring Northeast Asia. And so, furthermore, now that the bonds between Moscow and Beijing have tightened, and you can see this every day, and I'll give you one quick example. In his last tour, when he was in Africa, Tillerson criticized China's involvement in Africa. And as we know, China is very deeply involved in Africa. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Sergei Lavrov gets up there and denounces Tillerson for attacking China. Now, this is unusual behavior for a Russian foreign minister, unless he felt he needed to do it. And the only way that you could ascribe that motive to him is the point that China and Russia are allies. China is the rider and Russia the horse, in Bismarck's metaphor. And the rider told the horse, speak up. Or the horse felt it was necessary to speak up in order to appease the rider. If there is, in fact, this kind of identity of purposes between Russia and China, then they're certainly not going to do anything for our benefit. And even if it's in their benefit as they understand it, they may not do it because they are afraid of the consequences of losing influence in North Korea. And as a result, North Korea knows it has margins for provocation because it knows that whatever it does, it will take heat, it will take a hit, but China and Russia cannot afford to abandon it. The upshot of this is, and Christoph Bluth wrote this a decade ago when he was talking about the Bush administration's policies, the political philosophy on which the foreign policy of the Bush administration was based was incompatible with the realities on the ground in Northeast Asia. None of the key players in the region behaved in a manner compatible with U.S. policy. that is still the case. Summit may change that. The summit, therefore, offers us an opportunity as well as a challenge. The opportunity is to think seriously about what we want to see in Northeast Asia and in Korea in particular, and meld those two ideas together and come up with a North Korean and Northeast Asian policy that makes sense in terms of advancing American interests given the environment that now exists in the region. And in that environment, as the national security strategy has said, China is our adversary. North Korea may be the most urgent problem, but China is our adversary. And today, President Trump is launching immense tariffs on China as part of that economically adversarial relationship. Furthermore, if you look at why North Korea has gone for nuclear weapons, and that has been a generation-long quest, one of the main drivers has been, of course, the fear of the United States and of the pressure or the threat that we would unseat the regime, but also that at the end of the day, Moscow and Beijing would sell them out. If you look back at the meeting between Shevardnadze and Kim Il-sung in 1990, that's exactly the conclusion Kim Il-sung drew, that Moscow was selling him out. And Beijing's recognition of South Korea at about the same time fortified that conclusion, leaving him with little option but nuclear weapons as a way to maintain his security at home, his security against the United States, and his security against China and Russia. Russia is no longer in a position to dictate to North Korea or bring meaningful pressure to bear upon it. China is a different story. And therefore, one of the motives, at least on the Kim Jong-un, of the nuclear program is that having nuclear weapons means never having to say you're sorry to Beijing. Basically, they can tell Beijing to go to hell. And if you look at what he's done that. He purged everybody who was pro-China in the government, including his own uncle. He launched nuclear weapons despite Chinese admonitions not to do so. He made his own economic reform, if you want to, or something like that. Not what the Chinese are calling for. North Korea's nuclear weapons are, among other things, an attempt to declare their independence from Chinese tutelage. That provides an opportunity for us because the idea that if we rely on China to bring North Korea to the table means that we're going to assign to China the role of making North Korea its satellite. That, I would argue, is against American interests. A North Korea that is reasonably independent of China minimizes China's ability to dominate Northeast Asia. And that is in our largest strategic interest. Now, what that means is that as we go into the negotiations, we have to have the proposal in our minds and advance at least some of those ideas over the long process. This is not going to end with the summit. That is involved in the negotiation. And I have therefore outlined in the paper a series of ideas which are proposals. People may like them, they may reject them, they may find them to be insufficient or inadequate, and that's fine. I'm trying to start a debate and trying to help the administration think its way through the problem. But if you follow me, you'll see that it marks a major departure in what we've been doing up till now. But the situation that we have at hand is a completely new one, especially with the summit, and now with the fact that we have recognized North Korea. And the administration could say it's not made any concessions, but it has. I'll give you an example from history. I remember watching this on television 40 years ago. When Anwar Sadat recognized the state of Israel and flew to Jerusalem in 1977, actually to Tel Aviv, he lands his airplane there. He's met by Prime Minister Begin, and the world press is all over the place. And one Israeli reporter sticks the microphone in Sadat's face and says, Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, does this mean you recognize Israel? And Sadat said, I'm here. What recognition more do you want? I'm talking to you right here. I'm standing here in Tel Aviv. Same thing. Trump has given Kim Jong-un the status of equal, whether Trump realizes it or not, or refuses to admit it or not. Therefore, we have the opportunity through this negotiation process to create a new equilibrium in Northeast Asia that advances our interests and at the same time stabilizes the Korean Peninsula to some degree and reduces China's power over the actors to some degree. And here are the proposals. And it involves, first of all, the de facto, if not de jure, recognition of North Korea as a nuclear state. But that means, in turn, that North Korea has to take upon itself certain obligations. Number of nuclear weapons has to be capped, as the testing regime also has to be regulated. Third, it has to rejoin the Non-Proliferation Treaty and submit to rigorous IAEA verification, in return for which not only does it get recognition, the states party to the truce at Panmunjom will finally negotiate and sign a peace treaty that formally brings the state of war on the Korean Peninsula to an end. What does that mean? It means the termination of all acts of belligerency by everybody. And since North Korea is the main offender, that reduces North Korea's ability to threaten South Korea, as do the caps on its nuclear capability. In return for that, there will be cross guarantees by both Koreas of each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity as of today. And issues like the Northern Line limit can be negotiated. They will have embassies in each other's capital. There will be no acts of war. The other four powers to the six-party process will also guarantee each of the six states, so that the threat of an American attack on North Korea goes away. There'll be a North Korean embassy downtown. There'll be an American embassy in Pyongyang. We will then have a direct channel of communication with the regime. Sanctions, which are essentially acts of belligerency, would therefore gradually fade away as negotiated. Both parties would comply with the agreements and the relevant UN resolutions having to do with North and South Korea. Now, these accords would take coercive unification and the threat of war off the table. Not going to bring about nirvana, but it reduces the threat of war to a considerable degree and makes the initiation of acts of belligerency, let alone war, much more dangerous and costly for whoever does. And UN peacekeepers can be provided for the 38th parallel, give them the right kinds of rules of engagement, and they will be there as long as necessary to help keep the peace, as a further effort to keep tensions in check. In return for that, the U.S.-South Korean alliance remains as is, untouched. It'll be the sovereign choice of both Seoul and Washington to determine to what degree American troops remain there and what their mission will be, and so on and so forth. But that's going to be off the table. Since there is no threat to North Korea as a result of this agreement, the alliance remains unless South Korea or Washington decides to opt out of it, and that's their sovereign choice, as it is today. But it is not going to be a casualty, so to speak, of the negotiations. The parties, therefore, may modify or change the alliance as they see fit, because it will then be, visibly, as it is today, fundamentally and purely a defensive alliance. In that context, the parties can then address the issue of the terminal high-altitude air defense, THAAD, because we claim we put them in South Korea and Japan against North Korea. I suspect they're really there against China and Russia. Be that as it may, that's not the official line of the U.S. government. But if the situation on the Korean Peninsula is reduced in terms of tension, this opens a way for a discussion of those issues among Japan, South Korea, and the United States. That benefits China and Russia. Furthermore, both Korean states will reaffirm their adherence to existing international protocols concerning chemical and biological warfare. We know North Korea has extensive biological and chemical warfare capabilities. It is essential that we, bearing in mind the news, not only from Korea, that we reaffirm and strengthen those regimes. The fact that Syria has been using chemical weapons with impunity, and now that we've seen Russia use it in Great Britain, suggests not only that Syria broke, well, we know Syria broke this years ago, but that the Russians, despite their claims, have retained chemical warfare stocks or built new ones and are in violation of the OPCW, of the CWC, rather, the Chemical Warfare Convention. And there's reason to believe they have biological warfare. Russia's not the issue here, but we want to make sure that North Korea and South Korea, if they have that, cannot use those kinds of weapons. They're off the table. And again, there should be a verification regime that keeps that in mind. Given the sixth point, given the mutual recognition of both Koreas, termination of the state of war, and the ending of overtime of sanctions, the parties can then agree to offer North Korea energy and economic alternatives in return for the loss of nuclear power. This really benefits Moscow, because Moscow for a century has wanted a Trans-Siberian Trans-Korean railway, and now more recently a Trans-Siberian Trans-Korean gas pipeline. Has not been able to get it. Now, under a transformed condition, we can give that opportunity to the states to negotiate these kinds of deals. What's more, it would probably be in the West's interest to invest in that rather than let it be invested in by China. That gives Russia a stake in the situation in Northeast Asia, and it's a stake that is independent of China, so it doesn't have to run to China to get investments for its energy and so forth. It rewards the Russia's craving for status and for a recognized role in as a guarantor of peace and stability in Northeast Asia, and it distances them to some degree from China. And that benefits us, it benefits Japan, and it benefits South and North Korea. Furthermore, it reduces China's economic leverage on North Korea, and it opens up opportunities for Americans who want to invest, to whatever degree there is such an interest. And a transformed political situation, would, as well as the current economic reforms that Kim has launched, suggest that there might be opportunities for at least enterprising and risk-tolerant investors to make that kind of move. This gives Russia a stronger footing with regard to both Koreas and in Asia, reduces its need for China, and allows it to play a more independent role in Asia, and reduces China's ability, therefore, to threaten our interests. And if you notice, everything in this proposal has as its purpose not only ending the state of war and tension, but also reducing China's ability to profit from it. North Korea can then concentrate, as Kim seems to want, on economic development, and it doesn't have to worry so much about its military security. And it can therefore have more room to play its traditional game of balancing between Moscow and Beijing. Maybe even Washington can get into this as well. Now, this does not mean that the second coming is at hand and that peace is going to break out tomorrow, but it does provide a framework for resolving issues in Northeast Asia. It advances the interests of the United States and its allies. It gives North Korea what it wants: security of the state, security of the regime, opportunities for economic development. It deprives them of the nuclear weapon, but in a way that Kim Jong-un can claim, we got what we wanted. We don't need as many nuclear weapons now because the situation has transformed. It also benefits Russia. At the same time, if I may quote or paraphrase Don Corleone, it makes China an offer it can't refuse. There's no way, it's very difficult in the way I see it, and maybe I'm wrong, very difficult for China to say we can't support this arrangement, because it gives China something it wants: less tension, gets rid of the THAAD, or at least opens up a way to do so. Now, the point here also is that if this works, this does not mean that North Korea is going to become a liberal democratic state, or that Kim Jong-un is going to become a saint. He isn't, and he's not going to become one. But his opportunities for mischief making will be reduced, as well as his incentives for doing so. And it is a solution, I would argue, that is based on much greater realism and mutual benefit. that gets to the real issues in East Asia, not just North Korea's anomalous standing and threat of nuclear war, but the rise of China and the threats to the American alliance system there and the Russo-Chinese alliance that we see taking place. The United States now has an opportunity to deal with North Korea in a direct, unmediated fashion, in traditional diplomatic ways. South Korea does also. So does Japan. China's leverage on North Korea, therefore, will diminish, as will China's ability, therefore, to threaten the peace in Northeast Asia. Its leverage over Russia will also decline to some degree, and Russia's ability to play a more independent role grows. And the threat of war will be reduced. Now, while this is happening, that military pressure that I alluded to at the beginning of this lecture should continue, because that has to be the stick to compel North Korea to negotiate in good faith. And we can assume that if things go bad, North Korea is not going to accept its responsibility for doing so. It's going to be our fault again. And the Russians will tell you it's our fault anyway, as will the Chinese. So we need, I think, to change the game, because this game that we're losing, and this is a game where there's a lot of winners. Maybe not everybody wins as much, but everybody walks away with something they can live with. The point, however, is that this is based on realism, at least as I see it, not illusion. Our policy in the past has been based on illusion. It's been a fantasy. And at the end of the paper, I quote William Butler Yeats, who wrote 100 years ago during the Easter Uprising, "We have fed the heart with illusions. Our hearts have grown brutal on the fair." If we do not leave the realm of illusion, if we do not have a well-crafted proposal that takes account of realities in Northeast Asia and on the Korean Peninsula, we will remain trapped by our illusions, and not only our hearts, but our minds may grow brutal and find that we don't have any viable political alternative except from a position that is imposed upon us by other people. And the point of this proposal here, and the series of proposals that it embodies, is that we remain the initiating power, the leading power, and the one that continues, as has been the case for the last 75 years, to underwrite a peaceful equilibrium in Northeast Asia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blank, for that great presentation. And you wrote for us back in 2015, and I'm sorry that we missed out on your eloquence then. I'm glad we have it now. Next, we have David Maxwell. At the conference I referenced earlier, I'm going to borrow a line that was used to introduce him. He is a warrior scholar. I think it's very befitting of him. He is an independent national security consultant and the former associate director of the Security Studies program at Georgetown. He's a 30-year U.S. Army veteran, retiring as a Special Forces colonel, with his final assignment teaching at the National War College. He served in Asia for more than 20 years and spent a lot of time working in Korea with USFK and U.S. military forces there. So I will turn things over now to Colonel Maxwell, who will offer his comments and questions for Dr. Blank.
Thank you, Kyle, and thank you to KEI for having us and for really bringing Dr. Blank's expertise and a really outstanding paper. I think you'll all agree that this is, his presentation and his paper is innovative and certainly contributes to the thinking on this very, very critical problem. I hold so many of the same views, and although I express them probably in a little different way, and I'll go over that. But one of the things I really want to emphasize is his analysis of the illusions. And I think that's one of the important contributions that he makes. We labor under illusions about our Korea policy, about Northeast Asia, and of course, I'm a big supporter that we've got to look at the Korea problem beyond just denuclearization. So the framework for Northeast Asia is very, very important. And in fact, in my writings and research, and the people I talk to, in the administration, now is a time for a fundamental question. And Dr. Blank expressed this But the way I would look at it is, what do we really want to achieve in Korea? What do we want to achieve? Have we really asked that question? Or said another way, what is the acceptable, durable political arrangement on the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia that will serve and protect ROC and U.S. interests? I think that's really what Dr. Blank has been getting at, and so he has really laid that out. But I think we as Americans, we as part of the ROC U.S. alliance, Korean leaders, U.S. leaders, really need to answer that question as we move forward, because denuclearization is insufficient. Okay, and although it's obviously a key problem. I just want to give an anecdote to reinforce Dr. Blank's emphasis on illusions. I think the agreed framework in 1994 was based on, I usually call it an erroneous strategic assumption, but now that Dr. Blank has used the term illusion, I think we should, I'll say that the agreed framework was built on an illusion, and that was that we assumed that North Korea was going to soon collapse. We could make the agreement to build 2 light water nuclear reactors, to give 500,000 tons of fuel oil, in return for them freezing their nuclear program, because they weren't going to last too long. And of course, as we all know, they went through the arduous march, 94 to 96, starving anywhere from 500,000 to maybe up to perhaps 3 million Koreans living in the north. And of course, at the time, the director of the CIA told my boss, General Talleli, that on your watch, North Korea is going to collapse. And of course, in '96, we started heavy planning for the potential for North Korean collapse. But it was that assumption that that they were going to collapse that allowed us to agree to the agreed framework. But more importantly, we did not follow through with the pressure that we needed. Imagine if we had implemented a pressure campaign as we're doing now back then. And while sanctions may not change behavior, if we had implemented sanctions on the scale that we're doing right now, it is unlikely that they would have been able to develop their nuclear and missile programs as fast as they have. But I think because of the illusion of the potential of collapse, we neglected Korea. And of course, by 2006, they tested their first nuclear weapon. And of course, other intervening factors, the Sunshine Policy, which probably bailed out Korea, the amount of money that South Korea and resources that South Korea provided from 1997 to 2007 certainly helped Korea. But I think the illusion that they were going to collapse has guided us. And all of the other illusions that Dr. Blank has laid out, we really do need to step back and consider them. So, as I said, I hold some of the same views. I express them a little differently. For me, I think we have to try to understand North Korean strategy. And again, in the echo chamber, we'll say that survival of the regime is the vital national interest, not survival of the nation state, not survival of the Korean people living in the north, but survival of the regime. And so you hear that in the echo chamber, and I do believe that that is their vital national interest. But I think we forget that their strategic aim is unification of the peninsula on their terms in order to ensure survival. Now, that part of the equation, I think we overlook because they have 3 lines of effort in their quest for unification. The first one is subversion of the ROC political system. The second is coercion, to force the ROC into unification by threats. And the third, the worst case, of course, is the use of force, which is the ultimate course of action. Now, to be successful at subversion, coercion, and use of force, it requires one single major condition, and that is, of course, driving a wedge between the ROC-U.S. alliance and getting U.S. forces off the peninsula. And so, this is one of the reasons why I think when President Trump says that, if burden sharing doesn't work out and we pull U.S. troops off the peninsula, it certainly worries our Korean allies. Because without U.S. forces there, it will embolden Kim Jong-un. And this is why I think that one of the key points that Dr. Blank makes is that whatever agreements are made, the ROC-U.S. alliance must remain. I think that has to underpin all of our diplomacy and the way ahead, because without that, it invites mischief and more from the north, and it leaves the Korean Peninsula vulnerable. And then, of course, it will have real catastrophic effects on the peninsula in the region. And we should keep in mind that whatever happens in Northeast Asia, if there is regime collapse and some form of conflict, regardless of the scale, it's going to have global economic impact. It's going to impact us here at home. And so that's one of the reasons why the Korean Peninsula is so important. It is, the Korean proverb, a shrimp among whales, and it is surrounded by some whales. The second and third largest economy in China and Japan. Russia, even though it's only a 17-kilometer border with the north, Russia has a large presence or large influence in the region. And of course, the offshore balancer of the U.S. So the Korean Peninsula is the nexus of the major world powers, and both military, strategically, and economically. I think when we look at what has happened in the last year, I think it's important to recognize what our policy has been. We all, again, in the echo chamber, we talk about maximum pressure. That's what we hear, the administration's policy. We forget in that echo chamber that the second half of that is and engagement. President Trump has said we would engage, and if going back to his candidacy, he'd have a hamburger with Kim Jong-un, and maybe that's where the summit should take place, somewhere where they can both have a hamburger. But I think that we forget about that. And I think if we go back to the June 30th, 2017 joint statement between President Moon and President Trump, we have been following the strategy. We both said we want denuclearization. We said that we're going to use pressure and sanctions to get to the negotiating table. We said that the ROC was going to take the diplomatic lead. In particular, the ROC take the diplomatic lead in moving towards unification. And so when you look at that and you read that statement, we have been following that. Now, of course, I think and I agree that sanctions have had an effect. There are some reports that by October that the regime could be out of its currency reserves. Now, that may or may not be true, but I think the effect of sanctions, or the sanctions effects, have affected Kim Jong-un's strategic calculus. But I think also that we have to look at his actions through the lens of the strategy that I outlined. The other thing that I like about Dr. Blank's paper, again, is looking at beyond the nuclear program. I look at it as you've got to talk about the big five in Korea. And the big five, for me, is you've got to think about war. Okay, that's obviously the worst case. We have to deter, and if deterrence fails, we're going to defend, fight, and win. We've got to think about regime collapse. Regime collapse is going to result in some form of conflict if it happens. And of course, the conditions that lead to collapse can lead to a decision by Kim Jong-un to go to war. And we have to look at the indications and warnings that Dr. Blank mentioned. We haven't seen any military preparations, which I'm heartened by. But we also have to remember that North Korea, one are masters of denial and deception. And we are a victim of what we call creeping normalcy and the forward deployment of its military. And while I agree we will see preparations, they probably have a greater ability to initiate operations from a standing start than anyone else. And so, we have to be careful of strategic and operational surprise. And they have tried to offset that by the forward positioning of so many of their forces, particularly their artillery in hardened and deeply buried targets there. The third of my big five that we fail to talk about very much are human rights and the crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated against the Korean people living in the north. The 2014 Commission of Inquiry wanted to refer Kim Jong-un to the International Criminal Court, and that report has had an impact on the thinking of Kim Jong-un to the point where he has actually made changes to their human rights policy, recognizing that Koreans in the North have disabilities, and they've changed some of their laws on disabilities. Now, that's a very minor and certainly does not address the real human rights issues, but it shows that he responded to it. And what is counterintuitive for us is that when we focus on their nuclear threat, it reinforces the legitimacy of the regime. But when we focus on the human rights, it undermines the legitimacy of the regime. And so I will urge President Trump to talk to Kim Jong-un and address human rights. And of course, we've seen President Trump, more than any other president, call attention to North Korean human rights, both in his speech in Seoul as well as with Sung Ho at the State of the Union, raising the human rights atrocities is very, very important. Now, the fourth of the big five are the asymmetric threats, and this is the entire range, including the nuclear and missile, but also cyber, the largest special operations force in the world, and of course the provocations to gain politically economic concessions, and their illicit activities around the world. Again, that's something that we haven't addressed really until this past year, and I think that's very important. And of course, the last of the big five is unification. And I agree with Dr. Blank that the threat of forced unification, coerced unification, is not right, and it's not productive. However, unification, in my mind, and this is my bottom line, and I'll conclude after this. My bottom line is that I don't think we will ever see an end to the nuclear program or an end to the crimes against humanity until there is unification, until there is a united Republic of Korea, which United Republic of Korea, if you look at that acronym, it says you rock. And so I think that's something we should think about. Now, the one last point I want to make, I could make so many more, but I don't want to take too much time. It is about a framework for what we're doing. And what I would offer to Dr. Blank is that we should go back to the 1991-1992 North-South Agreement, the Agreement on Reconciliation, Non-Aggression, Exchanges, and Cooperation. That provided a framework for North-South peace, in fact, and for non-nuclearization, and reconciliation, exchanges, recognition, and that framework, of course, was signed when Kim Il Sung was still alive, and of course he died, in 1994, and it was never implemented. Like many agreements, or maybe all agreements that the North has agreed to, that have never really been implemented or have been broken. The 2005, the Leap Day Agreement, all of the agreements that the agreed framework, they either cheat, break, or ignore. But I would go back to Kim, and this is what I would recommend to President Trump. I'd say, and to President Moon, I think both presidents should propose this. We should start at the Agreement on Reconciliation, the North-South Agreement. That is a ready-made framework. And the advantage could be that we use the legacy of Kim Il Sung. We've seen Kim Jong-un try to emulate his grandfather and to take his legitimacy from his grandfather. And what I would say, and I'd say this to him directly, President Trump and President Moon, we will start at that point, and we will honor the legacy of your grandfather. He wanted this agreement. He allowed it to be signed, by his representatives. So let's start with his legacy. Let's honor his legacy, and then we can begin this long process that Dr. Blank alludes to and recognizes, because there's no quick end to any of this. But use that as a start point. And the advantage of doing that is, I think, is that it reverses the trap that has been set. Perhaps some people say that has been set by Kim Jong-un, although the offer to President Trump to meet, I think I think there were two things from that. One is it may have been a way to make South Korea look bad, because we haven't heard the regime acknowledge the offer, and everything is coming through South Korea. My first worry was that Kim Jong-un was going to eventually say, "I never said that," and what will that do to the Republic of Korea, who has been saying this was the message? And although I think we would get past that very easily, but I thought that might be one course of action. But what I really think is, I think President Trump caught Kim Jong-un off guard. I don't think he expected him to agree, or at least to agree as rapidly as he did. I don't think most of the pundits didn't think he would do that, and everybody is critical of it because he agreed so fast. But I think it caught Kim Jong-un and the propaganda and agitation department off guard, because I think they were probably all had their propaganda focused on attacking us for not agreeing to the invitation. So I think President Trump really took the initiative away. But I think the importance of using the previous agreements, the North-South agreement, and tying it to the legitimacy of Kim Il-sung is that because you can say to Kim Jong-un, if you don't follow that, then you are the one who is disrespecting your grandfather. And this is the way, I think, to inoculate both the South and the U.S. from any failure of the summit and the failure to have any concrete results, which, frankly, I don't think there should be any concrete results except for an agreement to negotiate, to proceed, for future talks. I mean, frankly, I think all the experts will tell you that this is not the way to conduct diplomacy. First we conduct diplomacy, and then we have the heads of states meet. So now the heads of state are meeting, and so I think what they should say is we need to develop a framework. We need to negotiate to try to achieve a workable solution. But if Kim Jong-un walks out, we are in a position then to say that we have offered something that has already been agreed to by his grandfather, and he is the one that is not honoring his grandfather's legacy. And I think that puts us in a better position to deal with things. And again, I'd say that right up front. President Trump is a hard negotiator. I think he can be really blunt with, I would like the visual of big, tall President Trump put his arm around Kim Jong-un and say, young man, this is what we have in store for you. You can either agree with us or, there will not be a good outcome. But I think we can offer something good. And I think Dr. Blank's proposals have much merit that we should definitely consider. So I'll close that.
Dr. Blank, would you like to respond to anything?
No, I don't have a response. I think that was well said.
I just want to abuse my power as moderator to ask one question, and then we'll move things over to the audience. One of a counterpoint that I'd like to raise with you, Dr. Blank, is by switching the priority from a regional security perspective to a non-proliferation perspective, or switching that order of importance. Some would argue you are risking a proliferation, an arms race, a nuclear arms race in East Asia if you take away, if you allow North Korea to have weapons. What about South Korea? What about Japan? So in this framework, how would that be addressed? Or would that be a breaking point, or would it be based off of allowing North Korea to have nuclear weapons? Would it be acceptable to have for Japan and South Korea to have nuclear weapons?
No, I think that for South Korea and Japan to have nuclear weapons would create a very dangerous situation, not just in Asia, globally. And, it's true, as I mentioned, for a long time in the 90s, and Colonel Maxwell knows this very well, the whole literature out there was the great threat, and George Bush said it also, the great threat is nonproliferation. As I said, North Korea is a nuclear state, like it or not. And sound policy making is based on the facts, as they are, not as we want them to be. We should stop feeding the heart with illusions, fantasies. If there is no agreement with North Korea on a political process, because that's the only way you're going to get any progress towards denuclearization, then they will continue to go nuclear or nuclearize their forces for a lot of reasons. They can't keep up economically otherwise, and they're already so far invested that they're not going to go back. And the more nuclear they become, the more Japan and South Korea will be under threat, and the more they will feel that whatever guarantees we have given them are not enough. And the pressure at home, the domestic pressure in both Seoul and Tokyo to go nuclear will grow. So that would lead to the outcome you're suggesting. Failure to arrest nuclear growth in North Korea generates more pressure in Tokyo and Seoul for their own nuclear weapons. But you can't take the nuclear issue out of its strategic and political context, which is what the whole proliferation debate is about. You have to denuclearize and then we'll negotiate. Well, nobody in his right mind would undertake negotiations on that basis. And as Colonel Maxwell said, we have to think the way they do. And what they see is that every state that signed a denuclearization guarantee with the United States has been attacked. And they're not wrong. You know, I remember writing about Ukraine 25 years ago when I was at the Army. And I've heard this from Ukrainians. You know, where were you when the Budapest Memorandum was violated? Well, you know, we were out to lunch. Out to lunch is not an answer. And North Korea is not going to accept it, and they don't have to accept it, especially because China and Russia will support them, covertly, if not overtly. So I think if you want to get denuclearization, that's essential to having a peace process and an equilibrium in Northeast Asia, then this is the way forward. And if this does come about, or something like it comes about, the pressure for South Korea and Tokyo to develop independent nuclear deterrence will diminish.
Thank you for that answer. Now we'll turn things over to the audience. We have a question right up here. Just if you could state your name and your affiliation before asking your question.
Thank you. Si Yang, reporter from Voice of America. A question to Dr. Blank. You mentioned in your speech that the understanding of denuclearization, North Korea's understanding of denuclearization is different from the United States. So could you elaborate on that? What does the United States mean by denuclearization, and what does the North Korea mean? Thank you.
The U.S. sees denuclearization as simply giving up your nuclear weapons in return for nothing. There's no tangible concession. Dismantling the nuclear program, subjecting it to verification, which North Korea regards as, by the way, as an intrusion on its sovereignty, and which frankly is an intrusion on your sovereignty, even in the United States, as part of the arms control program. You promise to denuclearize and start the process, and then we'll talk to you seriously. North Korea says that denuclearization can only come about if we are secure and if the United States ends its hostile policies, which means breaking up the alliance, which is a non-starter. Because you cannot have a peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula, given the real facts on the ground, unless the ROK-U.S. alliance stays. And as I said in the paper, if there's an agreement, then the parties are free to modify it in whatever direction they want. But it has to be there to ensure security and ensure that the United States can uphold its side of the bargain. Now, that means that when North Korea says denuclearization, it means something very different than the United States does. And what the United States is saying is denuclearization is frankly a fantasy. I have never heard of any state who is willing to give up even a developing program in return for insubstantial guarantees. And the events of the last 25 years will only harden that conviction. And if we're honest with ourselves, Libya, Iraq, Ukraine are pretty compelling examples. Because, you know, we didn't give a guarantee to Ukraine. We gave them assurances. That's a nice diplomatic cover. But when the fire began, the firefighters ran away. And that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable for any state. So I am one of those people who believes in general that when you have disarmament issues on the table, one side always says disarm first and then we'll talk about peace. And the other says peace is the prelude to disarmament. My sympathies generally go in the second direction. Because military operations are supposed to be in service of a political objective. You can guess I'm a real Clausewitzian in this regard. And if you don't have political objectives that are clearly defined, or you know what they are, or that are viable as negotiation points, then you're not going to get anywhere. So this gap in our understanding has to be understood, It's not insurmountable. But again, if you think if the only issue on the table is denuclearization, then you're not going to get either denuclearization or reductions in tensions or peace. And I think that's the issue.
Can I just add to that great explanation? Just to put we do say we'll guarantee security of the North, that we have no intention of attacking the North. We've said that in the past, and Dr. Blank is exactly right. A security guarantee to the North, for them to accept that, would mean breaking up the alliance, as he said, and ending the extended deterrence and the nuclear umbrella and getting U.S. forces off the peninsula. This is the objective of the North, and this is why I'm so I'm so adamant in agreement with maintaining the alliance, because the North, they would agree to denuclearization if we broke up the alliance and if we moved U.S. forces off the peninsula. But to me, that would be just a means to an end for them, and to get the conditions that they want, where they would be able to have domination, be able to influence and have domination over the South. And so we have to be careful about this and that's why there's that difference in denuclearization. We think denuclearization is North Korea with no nuclear weapons. They think denuclearization is the entire peninsula, and starting first with the security guarantees from the United States, which means no extended deterrence and U.S. forces off the peninsula. So we have to look at it, I think, through their strategy to understand what they're trying to do. But as long as we follow Dr. Blank's recommendation, keep the alliance strong, we will prevent the domination that will likely occur.
More questions? Okay, we'll take 3 questions this time. Start with Troy, the gentleman in the back, and the gentleman in the corner, and then we'll come to you the next round. So, Troy.
Thank you. Troy here at KEI. Fortunately, ironically, I have 3 questions, 2 for Dr. Blank and 1 for Dave, but I'll try to be quick. So I really like the presentation, Dr. Blank, but I have 2 questions for you. And I agree that we need to understand that China does not view interests the way that we do. And so in your presentation, I understand the appeal of perhaps creating an environment or an agreement afterwards to where China has less influence over North Korea, but that doesn't seem to be in China's interest. And in your discussion, you seem to have China be more of a passive actor in this, and it seems like its influence is more in the realm of being able to keep North Korea on its side rather than stop North Korea. So I would hope you would expand a little bit on China and how you see it playing into all of this. Also, you didn't talk about the missile programs. And if we have a process where it's an interim process, at least perhaps, to where the program is capped, what happens to the missiles? And if the ICBMs go away, but the shorter and medium-range missiles are kept, then you have a situation where South Korea and Japan are still under nuclear threat, but the United States isn't, and you run the risk of alliance separation. So your thoughts on the missile side of things. And then, Dave, you brought up that they haven't lived up to agreements. So if we get into this type of framework, how do we ensure that they're actually living up to things this time? Thank you.
Okay, maybe we'll just answer this one really quickly, and then we'll go to the other 2, because Troy asked 3 questions.
Yeah, none of which is simple. I don't see China as a passive actor, but I have another article that's coming out actually from 38 North, where I said, as of today, there are certain takeaways we can see in this process. And one of them shatters, because it happened after I wrote the paper, shatters the illusion that we need China to bring North Korea to the table. Kim Jong-un, whatever he may have heard from China, made this proposal all by himself, starting on New Year's Day. And he didn't need China to do it. As a matter of fact, the day after Trump said, oh yeah, I'll do it, I'll meet, there's an article in Global Times telling the Chinese people, don't worry don't panic about thinking that you've been marginalized. Well, if as we say in Russian, do not let the bear out of the woods, so to speak. That was letting the bear out of the woods, because not only Japan was blindsided, Beijing was too. What it says to me is that if North Korea decides we need to have an outreach with the United States, it doesn't need to go through China. And the Chinese are deeply aware of that, deeply conscious of that. And this series of proposals does not say that China is going to be a passive actor. But as I said, we're making China an offer it can't refuse. We're going to help you with your problem of North Korea's nuclearization. We're going to end the state of war on the Korean Peninsula. We're going to create an opportunity for you to get back into North Korea economically, albeit under changed circumstances. And fourth, we're going to reduce the danger of war on the peninsula altogether. The price you pay is that we now are talking to North Korea directly. You're not. Russia has a bigger stake than you would give it. And they don't need to go through you. But China wins, but it loses. My concern is not to advance the Chinese national interest, but the American national interest. And I don't think the Chinese would be able to interfere too much in this. But again, it's up to the United States to craft a well-conceived policy that takes into account the regional dimensions of all this, and that China, Japan, Russia, and South Korea all have voices and are going to endeavor and to some degree successfully make those voices heard. And I can tell you from my experience, when I was with the Army, that we don't do that very often. I mean, I don't know if I have time to give you an anecdote. When I was with the Army War College, Colonel called me up from USARPAC, U.S. Army Pacific, and said, we want you to organize a game on Korea, because I used to play Russia a lot in these games. And I said, okay. And he said, here's our scenario. He says, there's a tsunami wipes out the North Korean government. Okay. You don't argue with the scenario. We go in. I said, well, just wait a minute. What do you mean we go in? Who authorized you to go in? The UN? And what are your rules of engagement? Who's in control of nuclear weapons? Who's in command of them? What about China? Because they're going to go into, and the game there was no game. Because people in reasonably high positions didn't bother to think through any of these issues. Now, that's what's necessary here. I tried to think through China. If China really is the adversary in the Northeast Asian sector, and I believe it is, then why are we trying to get China to have more power over North Korea? When North Korea is doing everything it can, if we understood it, to get out from under China in terms of their own perception of the world. And that should lead you to start thinking in different ways about this. Second question, about missiles. It's a good point. When I say the nuclear program, I mean as well the missiles. We're not going to get rid of all the missiles. That will stay there until it's negotiated away. But we reduce the salience of the threat, which is, I think, the limit of what we can practically accomplish today. Because without a negotiating process, the threat grows. And as I answered somebody before, the demand for nuclear weapons grows. And I will quote you what the former ambassador to China said to me about what Li Peng said to him. Nuclear weapons in North Korea, small problem. Nuclear weapons in Japan, big problem. Let's deal with the small problems rather than the big ones.
Just let me add one point. I was at a conference which unfortunately had Chatham House rules, but I heard a senior leader say something that I think really impacts on what Dr. Blank has been saying on your question. And he said words to the effect that the United States, has a North Korea policy. China, and I would add Russia, has a U.S. policy. And I think that to me is really telling. When they think about North Korea, it's not about North Korea. It's about the United States and our role on the peninsula. So, this is where we are at cross purposes. And I think this is why our national security strategy, highlights the competition, and China's role and that we face. So we have a North Korea policy, but China and Russia have a U.S. policy. That to me is a deep thought. Now, Troy, you asked the ultimate gotcha question, but it is the right question, and I wish I could give an answer, but I will say this, too often in the past, we have given up something for nothing from the North. They've been masterful at that. I'm heartened right now that President Trump says we're not going to end sanctions, we're not going to reduce them just on the promise of a meeting. But in the past, we've made those kind of agreements. But how do you hold the North to live up to the agreement? I mean, that's the hardest question. I think it has to be underpinned with military strength. there has to be substantive change that is verifiable in the North. But the bottom line is, we can't reduce pressure until they take substantive action, and that's the conundrum that we're in, because they're not going to take substantive change, and so your question is the hardest one, and I just can't give you a good answer, except that, as Dr. Blank alluded to, this is going to take a long time, So and the other thing is that we can't neglect it. That's we can't come to an agreement and okay, that one's in the bank, it's on the shelf. Let's move on to the next problem. This problem, until there are no nuclear weapons there, we are going to have to cope. We're going to have to contain. We're going to have to manage this process until there is a successful resolution.
Let me just answer part of this also. As Colonel Maxwell said, this is the hardest question. And, and all the people who will be opposed to negotiation will say, well, they can't be trusted. I'm not saying they can be trusted. But the proposals I have made, and that maybe other people will come up with other proposals, similar ones, offer them something that they really want. And they have to, in order for them to be complying with whatever is agreed to, they have to realize that they have something to lose by not doing so. That means the game has to, the nature of the game as it is today has to be changed. Because today they do not pay a penalty which they think is insuperable for violating agreements. But if you look at what Kim Jong-un has been saying, he really does, I think, want to modernize his economy. There's academic literature on this point. That's not just me saying it. And therefore, he has something to lose if something like this agreement or this agreement, the way I outlined it, don't come into being. They may run out of foreign currency in October. This administration will continue to ratchet up economic pressure and military pressure. And if they are serious about trying to move in a somewhat different domestic direction, that will hurt. That'll hurt substantively. And therefore, they may feel that the cost of not moving forward is outweighed by the benefits they stand to gain. And that's always what you want to see in a negotiation process.
Okay, we'll take those 3 questions, 1, 2, 3 in that order. We can keep the answers short so we can get more questions on the floor.
Along your lines of realism and not illusion, brinksmanship is something that I feel like maybe wasn't in the context of your paper, but I think is also important to consider here. You're a Russia scholar. Kennedy and Khrushchev, predictable. They knew what buttons not to push. They knew what buttons they could push with each other. You don't think so? They learned. And I don't think, right, sure, understandable. So here I think you have rational. I agree that we have 2 rational heads of state, but predictable, I don't know that we do. And so how do you think brinksmanship would come into play in the context of both this first summit and the long-term framework? And how can we mitigate any, potential problems that it may cause? Excessive.
Hi, Dad Lieberman. I'm a writer. I believe you have some very meritorious proposals, Dr. Blank, but I'm wondering if it's not an illusion to think that the U.S. whose policies have mainly been creating instability, would ever adopt these proposals. If you look at the Middle East, the United States has been involved in the Middle East for many years, in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and nothing but instability in the Middle East. North Africa with Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Somalia, instability. If you go into our own hemisphere, the Caribbean and Central America, crime, poverty, instability. And here the U.S. has been involved in the Korean Peninsula for 70 years. And all we have after 70 years is now a nuclear weapon, which indirectly the U.S. has really pushed North Korea into. Now, Russia and China, which border on North Korea, don't seem to be too perturbed about North Korea, but yet U.S. 5,000 miles away, entirely perturbed. So I wonder if it's not an illusion to think that after 70 years of not resolving any of the problems on the Korean Peninsula, that the United States can be any way a positive force for peace in the Korean Peninsula?
Thank you. Diane Perlman, School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason, and also planning to represent mediators beyond borders at the UN High-Level Conference on Nuclear Disarmament in May. This is one of the best things I've heard, and thank you so much for your creativity. And, you know, one way of framing it is that you're dealing, instead of dealing with the symptom, you're dealing with the causes and the underlying relationship, which is called second-order change. And also the issue of like win-win or giving creative face-saving way out. And, you know, one thought I had, the way this came about was kind of a fluke in terms of this summit. And it seems like it leapfrogged over a lot of like normal processes that would have been fraught with peril. And also didn't mention the role of Moon and the Moon Jae-in and the Olympics, which was, I think, you know, sort of an alignment of, you know, beneficial forces happening. So, and just one thing, the way to be more secure is to make your enemy more secure, which is what you seem to be tuned into. So one question is, who's listening? And are the people that are preparing for the summit listening to your input? Are they taking it seriously? I mean, it seems like you have an essential contribution to make. And maybe in response to the last comment, whether the U.S., like what about, you know, I'm sort of talking with mediators beyond borders, like having teams of mediators participate.
Okay. First of all, with regard to brinksmanship, I'm less convinced than you are that we have two rational actors, and I'll leave it to you to figure out which one I think isn't. But I'm concerned about the process because I don't see that, as I mentioned earlier, I don't see that we are up to speed in the preparations necessary for what needs to be a long, drawn-out process, either institutionally or cognitively. And as far as brinksmanship only pays off if you are strategically focused. Khrushchev and Kennedy almost came to blows, because they were not that strategically focused. They didn't understand each other's intentions or capabilities very well at all, and reactions. And, you know, the literature on the Cuban Missile Crisis is extensive, and it shows what happens when this happens. And I mean, in the Russian case now, there are a lot of similarities between what Mr. Putin is doing and the way Khrushchev treated the U.S. under Eisenhower and Kennedy, but that's a different lecture. So I'm worried about that. I worry a great deal about the disarray in this administration on foreign policy in general, not just Korea. Obviously, as a Russia expert, we have a lot of other concerns. So I'll have to leave it at that, but you understand where I'm coming from there. As for the second question, I disagree with the premise to begin with. The U.S. sometimes plays a positive role, sometimes not, but it's not been a negative role. The U.S. role in Northeast Asia has saved South Korea from communism. It's made it into, the 11th largest economy in the world and a model democracy. It has been a beacon of hope for Koreans and for Asians all over the world, which would not have been the case if we'd lost in 1952, 53. And as far as the Middle East, yes, our policies have been a failure. I will agree with you there. But we didn't cause it. We added to instability that was there. The Middle East has been unstable since I was born and before that. And it's not going to be stable after we're gone, I'm afraid, unless there's an act of God, I think. Because and the roots of instability in these places are deep-rooted. They go deep. The United States has contributed to them in many ways, either advertently or inadvertently. But there have been times when the U.S. has been a force for peace. In the 70s, the U.S. was a force for peace in the Middle East. The Clinton administration did everything under the sun to bring peace between Israel and the Palestinians walked away from it. So our record is checkered. But in Korea, our record is a lot better. It's not perfect. Nobody's is. But the issue is not to say for 60 years you've been an SOB, and now you're going to tell us that you've reformed? No. Crisis is an opportunity as well as a challenge. I want to emphasize the opportunity because I'm afraid that if we don't take advantage of it, the challenge will overwhelm us and we'll end up going down the same bad alley we've been going through for the last 25 years. So I dispute the premise of your question to begin with, and we can debate that later. As far as who's listening, well, this paper only came out today, so I haven't had any contact with anybody in the government. Hopefully they'll see it and they'll contact me, or they'll think about it, and they will come to their own conclusions and hopefully come up with the best possible policy. But it's easy in this town to despair of being heard, as everybody here well knows. I mean, I can tell you as a Russian scholar, I'm answering questions today that I answered 50 years ago when I was a college student, and that does not make me feel optimistic. I see things in the newspapers every day that just drive me crazy because I think nobody is listening. I'm out there writing, I'm out there speaking, but that's what I can do. If people choose to listen, fine. If they don't, well, that's their choice. And at the end of the day, we all pay the consequences for our sins of omission or of commission. But there's not much I can do. I can offer my ideas. I'd be happy to talk about this to anybody who wants to listen to it. Here or elsewhere, but if they have better ideas, so be it. If they don't, well, then that's their choice.
The paper will actually be up online shortly, so have more opportunity to widely disseminate it. Well, unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Please join me in thanking both Dr. Blank and Colonel Maxwell for their time.